There's a person in your life right now who makes you feel smaller every time you walk away from them. You can't pinpoint exactly what they did. They didn't insult you directly. They didn't attack your character openly. But something about the interaction leaves you drained, confused, questioning your own reality. You replay the conversation in your head for hours afterward, wondering if you overreacted, if you misunderstood their tone, if maybe you're the problem after all. That's not an accident. That's precision. Because while you've been taught to recognize obvious manipulation, to spot the loud predators and the aggressive controllers, there's an entire class of psychological operators moving in silence. They don't need to raise their voice to dominate you. They don't need to threaten to control you. They've mastered something far more elegant and infinitely more dangerous. They farm your energy like a resource. They harvest your emotions like a crop. And they do it with such surgical subtlety that you thank them for the privilege. Welcome to the shadow economy of human interaction, where your attention, your validation, your emotional responses become currency in a game you didn't know you were playing. This isn't about the obvious manipulators. This is about the ones who smile while they drain you, the ones who leave you feeling empty while they walk away energized, the ones who have turned psychological vampirism into an art form. By the time this video ends, you'll see these patterns everywhere. In your workplace, in your family dynamics, in your social circles, even in your closest relationships. Because once you understand how emotional vampires operate, how they farm aura and manufacture dependency, you can't unsee it. And more importantly, you can't be drained by it. But here's what most people get wrong about dark psychology. They think it's about becoming the predator. They think the solution is to out-manipulate the manipulators, to become colder, crueler, more calculating than those who target them. That's not power. That's surrender. Real power is immunity. Real strength is becoming undrainable. And that's exactly what we're building today. The first thing you need to understand is this. Energy vampires don't announce themselves. They don't walk into rooms with fangs bared and capes flowing. They arrive with compliments, with apparent vulnerability, with what seems like genuine interest in your life. They study you with the focus of a scientist and the patience of a hunter. Because they've learned something most people never realize. The best way to control someone isn't through fear. It's through their need to feel special. Think about the last time someone made you feel uniquely understood. They listened to your problems with unusual intensity. They remembered details from previous conversations that even close friends had forgotten. They seemed to see qualities in you that others overlooked. It felt incredible, didn't it? Like finally, someone got it. Someone saw your value. But here's the trap. That feeling wasn't random. It was manufactured. Because emotional vampires don't just drain energy randomly. They farm it systematically. Aura farming is the process of cultivating someone's emotional investment in you so thoroughly that they become a renewable resource. Not a one-time victim, but a sustainable source of validation, attention, drama, and psychological supply. The farmer doesn't just take what's available. They plant seeds that grow into dependency. They water those seeds with intermittent reinforcement, and they harvest the crop whenever they need an emotional boost. Watch how this works. First, they mirror your energy perfectly. If you're excited, they match your enthusiasm. If you're struggling, they reflect your pain with uncanny accuracy. This isn't empathy. This is mimicry. They're not feeling what you feel. They're performing what you need to see, so you'll lower your guard and open your emotional vault. Because people don't protect themselves from those who seem to understand them completely. Next, they become your emotional thermometer. They start commenting on your moods, your energy levels, your reactions in ways that seem helpful, but are actually conditioning. They'll say things like, "You seem really stressed lately. I can tell because you get that look in your eyes." Or, "I love how passionate you get about this. Most people wouldn't understand, but I can see how much it means to you. They're not just observing your emotions, they're cataloging them, building a database of your triggers, your weak spots, your sources of pride and shame. Then comes the intermittent reinforcement schedule. This is where most people get hooked without realizing it. The vampire doesn't give you constant attention. That would be too obvious, too easy to resist. Instead, they alternate between intense focus and calculated withdrawal. One day they're fascinated by every word you say. The next day they're distant, distracted, seemingly annoyed by your presence. This creates what psychologists call variable ratio reinforcement, the same mechanism that makes gambling addictive. Your brain starts chasing that high of their approval. When they're warm, you feel elevated. When they're cold, you feel confused and desperate to regain their favor. You start monitoring their moods more carefully than your own. You begin adjusting your behavior to maintain their interest. You're no longer just interacting with them. You're performing for them. And performance requires energy. Constant performance depletes it entirely. But the real genius of emotional vampirism isn't in what they take. It's in what they make you give willingly. Because the most effective vampires don't steal your energy. They convince you to hand it over as a gift. They make you feel like you're helping them, supporting them, being a good friend or partner or colleague. They position themselves as the victim while systematically draining everyone around them. This is where the concept of manufactured crisis becomes crucial. Emotional vampires don't just respond to drama. They create it. Not obvious, explosive drama that would expose them as the source. Subtle, persistent drama that keeps everyone around them in a constant state of emotional activation. They'll create problems that only you can solve. They'll have emergencies that require your immediate attention. They'll develop insecurities that need your constant reassurance. Each crisis feels legitimate in isolation. But when you step back and look at the pattern, you'll notice something disturbing. Their problems never actually get solved. Your solutions never quite work. Your support never seems enough. That's because resolution isn't the goal. Dependency is. They need you to need to help them. They need you to feel responsible for their emotional state. Because once you accept that responsibility, you've become their personal energy generator. The most sophisticated vampires take this even further. They don't just drain you directly. They turn you into a vampire yourself without your knowledge. They teach you to seek validation in the same ways they do. They model emotional manipulation so subtly that you start adopting their tactics without realizing it. Soon, you're craving the same kind of intense emotional connections they demonstrated. You're creating the same kind of manufactured crises in your other relationships. You've become part of their ecosystem of energy exchange. This is how emotional vampirism spreads like a virus through social networks, through families, through entire organizations. It's not just individual predators hunting isolated victims. It's entire cultures of people who have learned to survive by feeding on each other's emotional energy instead of generating their own. And once you're inside that system, once you're dependent on external validation for your sense of worth, breaking free requires more than just recognizing the problem, because here's what makes this form of psychological manipulation so insidious. The vampires often believe their own performance. They've convinced themselves that their need for constant emotional supply is actually deep sensitivity, that their manipulation is actually intuition, that their draining behavior is actually love. They're not consciously evil. They're unconsciously destructive. And that makes them even more dangerous because they can pass every sincerity test while slowly destroying everyone who gets close to them. The question isn't whether you've encountered emotional vampires. You have. The question is whether you've learned to recognize them before they've established their feeding pattern. Whether you can spot the signs before you're already caught in their web of manufactured dependency. And most importantly, whether you understand the difference between genuine connection and psychological harvesting. Because in the next part of this series, we're going to dissect the specific tactics these energy farmers use to establish control. We're going to examine the 7 stages of aura farming, from initial targeting to complete psychological capture. And we're going to build your immunity to each stage so that no one can ever again drain your energy without your conscious permission. But first, you need to accept a hard truth. If this information feels familiar, if these patterns remind you of specific people in your life, you're not imagining things. Your instincts are correct, and the fact that you're still questioning yourself, still wondering if you're overreacting or being unfair, is proof that their programming is still running in your mind. The programming runs deeper than you think. It's not just in how you second-guess yourself after difficult interactions. It's in how you've been trained to interpret your own emotional responses as problems to be solved rather than signals to be trusted. Because emotional vampires don't just drain your energy in the moment. They rewire your internal warning system so you'll ignore the alarms next time they go off. This is the most elegant aspect of psychological vampirism. They don't just take what they need and disappear. They install software in your mind that keeps generating supply long after they've moved on to other targets. You'll find yourself replaying conversations, analyzing tone, searching for hidden meanings in casual statements. You'll spend hours trying to decode what they really meant, what they really wanted, whether you responded correctly to their subtle tests. That mental energy you're burning in analysis, that's still feeding them, even when they're not physically present, even when they haven't contacted you in weeks. Your mind is still running their program, still trying to solve the puzzle they intentionally made unsolvable, still seeking their approval for decisions they'll never know you made. You've become a battery that charges itself. Watch how this programming spreads through your other relationships. You start interpreting neutral responses as rejection. You begin reading criticism into casual observations. You develop hypersensitivity to tone, to facial expressions, to the spaces between words. What feels like emotional intelligence is actually emotional hypervigilance. You're not becoming more aware. You're becoming more reactive. And reactive people are easy to control. The vampire doesn't need to be present to influence your behavior anymore. They've taught you to vampire yourself. Every time you doubt your perception, every time you minimize your discomfort, every time you explain away someone's cruel behavior as misunderstanding, you're doing their work for them. You've internalized their voice as your voice of reason. This is why breaking free from emotional vampires feels impossible even after you've identified them. It's not enough to remove them from your life. You have to deprogram the software they installed. You have to unlearn the habit of seeking external validation for internal experiences. You have to rebuild trust in your own emotional responses after they've taught you. Those responses are unreliable. But here's where most recovery advice gets it wrong. It focuses on boundaries, on saying no, on protecting yourself from future vampires. All valuable skills, but they're defensive measures. They assume you'll always be vulnerable, always be a potential victim, always need protection from predators who are fundamentally stronger than you. That's not immunity. That's managed vulnerability. Real immunity comes from understanding something the vampires themselves don't realize. They're not feeding on your strength. They're feeding on your weakness. Specifically, your weakness for external validation, your need to be seen as good, your fear of being misunderstood or disliked. The energy they're draining isn't your life force. It's your insecurity. And insecurity is renewable as long as you keep generating it. This means the solution isn't building walls. It's eliminating the resource they're trying to harvest. When you no longer need their approval, they can't withhold it as leverage. When you no longer fear their judgment, they can't use it as a weapon. When you no longer seek their validation, they have nothing to offer that you want. But becoming undrainable requires more than just intellectual understanding. It requires emotional rewiring. Because your need for validation wasn't installed by vampires. It was cultivated by years of social conditioning that taught you to measure your worth through other people's responses. The vampires just learned to exploit a system that was already running. Think about how you learned to seek approval. Through school systems that rewarded compliance and punished independent thinking. Through family dynamics that made love conditional on behavior. Through social structures that taught you to perform identity rather than develop it. Through media that convinced you happiness comes from external recognition rather than internal satisfaction. The vampires didn't create your hunger for validation. They just learned to position themselves as the only source of the specific validation you crave most. This is why traditional advice about manipulation feels so inadequate. It tells you to recognize red flags, to trust your instincts, to maintain boundaries. But what if your instincts have been compromised by years of conditioning to distrust them? What if your red flag detection system has been calibrated to ignore precisely the behaviors that threaten you most? What if your boundaries have been eroded so gradually you don't remember what they were supposed to protect? The vampire doesn't overcome your defenses. They convince you to lower them voluntarily. They make you feel safe enough to be vulnerable, understood enough to share secrets, special enough to accept treatment you'd never tolerate from anyone else. They create a psychological environment where your normal protective mechanisms feel unnecessary, even counterproductive. And once those mechanisms are disabled, once you've learned to interpret your discomfort as your problem rather than their behavior, once you've accepted responsibility for managing their emotions while neglecting your own, you've entered what I call the harvest zone. This is where the real feeding begins. In the harvest zone, every interaction becomes extractive. They're not having conversations with you. They're mining you for material. Your stories become their entertainment. Your struggles become their supply of drama. Your successes become opportunities for them to either take credit or diminish your achievement. Your failures become proof that you need their guidance, their support, their continued presence in your life. But the most insidious part of the harvest zone is how natural it feels. You're not being obviously exploited. You're being subtly redirected. Every conversation somehow becomes about them. Every problem you mention becomes an opportunity for them to share a bigger problem. Every achievement you celebrate becomes a reminder of something they accomplished that was more impressive. They're not stealing your spotlight. They're dimming it so gradually you don't notice the room getting darker. This gradual dimming is what makes emotional vampirism so difficult to detect and even harder to escape. There's no dramatic moment of betrayal, no obvious violation that justifies cutting them off. Just a slow leak of energy, a gradual erosion of self-trust, a progressive transfer of emotional labor from them to you. By the time you realize what's happening, they've become so integrated into your decision-making process that removing them feels like removing part of yourself. And that's exactly what they've been working toward. Not just dependency, but identity fusion. They want to become so essential to your sense of self that imagining life without them feels impossible. They want you to believe that losing their approval means losing your worth. That disappointing them means failing as a person. That their absence would leave a void nothing else could fill. This is the final stage of aura farming, complete psychological capture, where the victim becomes so identified with the vampire's needs that they can't distinguish between serving the vampire and serving themselves, where resistance feels like self-harm and compliance feels like self-care, where the vampire's voice becomes indistinguishable from the victim's own inner voice. But there's something vampires never expect, something that disrupts their entire system and renders their carefully constructed psychological architecture useless. Something so simple they can't prepare for it because it requires giving up the very thing they're trying to harvest. The moment you stop needing their approval, the entire game collapses. Not gradually, not with struggle, but instantly, because their power was never real. It was borrowed. borrowed from your willingness to hand over the keys to your emotional state, to make their opinion more valuable than your own experience, to treat their validation as the currency of your worth. Watch what happens when you withdraw that permission. When you stop explaining yourself to someone who was never genuinely confused. When you stop defending positions to someone who was never actually listening. When you stop performing for someone who was never really watching you, just cataloging your reactions for future use. The vampire doesn't adapt. They don't evolve new strategies. They don't become more sophisticated in their approach. They simply move on. Because they were never interested in you specifically. They were interested in what you provided. And if you're no longer providing it, you're no longer useful. This reveals something crucial about the nature of these relationships. They were never about connection. They were about extraction. The vampire didn't see you as a person to know, but as a resource to harvest. Your thoughts, your feelings, your energy, your time were never valued for their own sake, but for what they could provide to someone whose inner world had become a barren landscape. Here's the final truth about emotional vampires. They're not powerful predators. They're psychological beggars. They've never learned to generate their own emotional energy, their own sense of worth, their own internal validation. They live in a constant state of emotional poverty, surviving only by taking from others what they've never learned to create for themselves. And once you see them clearly, once you understand that their manipulation comes from desperation rather than strength, once you realize that their control over you was always an illusion you maintained, something remarkable happens. Pity replaces fear. Clarity replaces confusion. Boundaries become effortless because you're no longer protecting something valuable from someone powerful. You're simply declining to subsidize someone's emotional bankruptcy. The person who cannot be drained is not the person with the strongest walls. It's the person who no longer generates the energy these vampires feed on. It's the person whose sense of worth comes from within, whose validation is self-generated, whose emotional state is self-regulated. It's the person who has learned the difference between being alone and being lonely, between being misunderstood and being wrong, between being disliked and being worthless. This is your immunity. Not the ability to spot vampires before they strike, but the ability to become someone they can't feed on. Because when you're no longer hungry for external validation, when you're no longer afraid of social rejection, when you're no longer performing for approval, you become invisible to emotional predators. Not because you're hiding, but because you have nothing they want. And in that invisibility, in that self-sufficiency, in that quiet confidence that needs no audience and seeks no applause, you find something the vampires will never understand. You find peace, real peace, the kind that doesn't depend on circumstances, doesn't require maintenance, doesn't need protection. The kind that exists not because nothing can touch you, but because you've learned that what matters most was never touchable in the first place. The game was rigged from the beginning, but you were never required to play.